Danny Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he stood in the middle of his grandfather's old garage. The building smelled like oil and rust and memories. His grandfather had passed away 6 months ago, and Danny had been putting off this task for too long. The property needed to be cleaned out and sold. The old man had been a strange fellow, according to most people in town. He worked for the Air Force back in the 50s and spent the rest of his life tinkering in this converted barn behind his Montana house. Danny had loved him despite his secrets and odd habits. The garage was filled with tools and car parts and mysterious boxes that seemed to have no purpose. Danny had been working for 3 hours when his wrench slipped from his hand. It fell between 2 floorboards with a metallic clang that sounded wrong. Wood on metal shouldn't sound like that. He got down on his knees and peered through the gap. There was something underneath the floor that looked smooth and metallic. That was definitely not normal for a garage built in 1947. Danny grabbed a crowbar from his truck and started prying up the floorboards. The wood came up easily, like it was meant to be removed. Underneath was a panel made of some material he had never seen before. It was smooth like glass but felt warm to the touch, like it had its own heat source. There were symbols etched into the surface, and they definitely were not English or any language Danny recognized from his high school classes. He ran his fingers over the symbols, and the panel suddenly lit up with a soft blue glow. His heart started racing as the panel slid open, with a sound like air escaping from a sealed container. Below was a cylindrical chamber that looked exactly like an elevator shaft. The walls inside were the same strange material as the panel, and they seemed to shimmer with an internal light that had no obvious source. The chamber was big enough for 3 people to stand comfortably. Danny knew he should probably call someone. The police maybe, or the government, or whoever handles weird underground chambers, but his curiosity was stronger than his common sense. He stepped inside the chamber and immediately felt like he had made a terrible mistake. The door sealed shut behind him with that same hissing sound. Danny pulled out his phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Before panic could fully set in, the floor began to move. It was descending smoothly and silently like the most expensive elevator in the world. Danny tried to guess how deep he was going, but lost count after what felt like 300 feet. The descent continued for nearly 10 minutes. That was impossible because 10 minutes of steady descent would put him miles underground. When the elevator finally stopped and the doors opened, Danny forgot how to breathe for a moment. He was standing at the entrance to a massive underground facility that stretched so far, he could not see the end of it. The architecture was like nothing he had ever seen in any movie or photograph. The walls curved in ways that seemed to defy geometry, and they were made of materials that shifted between metallic silver and crystal clear, like they could not decide what they wanted to be. Light came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. There were no visible bulbs or fixtures, but the entire space was illuminated with a soft white glow. In the center of the main chamber sat what could only be described as a spaceship. It was sleek and angular, with wings that swept back like a bird of prey. The hull was covered in the same symbols he had seen on the elevator panel. The ship looked dangerous and beautiful at the same time. Next to the ship was a workbench that looked oddly human compared to everything else. On the bench was a leather journal that looked worn and old. Danny walked over and picked it up. His hands were shaking. The name embossed on the cover made his blood run cold. It was his grandfather's name. He opened the journal to the first page. The date written at the top was April 15, 1952. The handwriting was definitely his grandfather's. Danny recognized it from birthday cards and Christmas letters. The entry began with a simple sentence that changed everything Danny thought he knew about his family. His grandfather wrote that he had found the elevator 3 days ago while doing foundation work for the garage. He had gone down just like Danny had. He had found this facility and the ship and something else, something he called the archive. Danny flipped through the pages, reading entries that spanned decades. His grandfather had been coming down here regularly for over 50 years. He had been in contact with something called Vorentines. They were not human. They were an ancient race that had hidden repositories of knowledge throughout the galaxy. Earth had been chosen as one of their hiding spots millions of years ago, before humans even existed. The elevator and the facility were meant to stay hidden until humanity was ready to find them. But something had gone wrong, according to the later entries. His grandfather had learned about another race called the Kryn Dominion. They were warriors and conquerors who had been hunting for Vorentine sites for centuries. They wanted the technology and knowledge stored in places like this facility. They would use it as weapons to control the galaxy. His grandfather had spent years working with the Vorantines to keep this place hidden and safe. He had even helped advance human technology in secret using knowledge from the archive. The final entry in the journal was dated just 2 weeks before his grandfather died. The handwriting was shaky and hard to read. It said that the Kryn were getting closer to finding Earth. They had detected something that led them to this solar system. His grandfather wrote that he was too old now to protect the facility anymore. He hoped that whoever found this journal would be brave enough to finish what he started. The last line made Danny's stomach twist into knots. It said that the war never ended and it was only paused and they were coming back. Danny sat down on the floor next to the workbench because his legs would not hold him up anymore. He was a mechanic from a small town in Montana. He fixed trucks and tractors for a living. He was not prepared to deal with ancient alien technology and galactic wars and whatever else his grandfather had gotten involved with. But as he sat there looking at the ship and the facility and the journal in his hands, he realized something important. His grandfather had trusted him to find this place. The old man could have destroyed the elevator or sealed it permanently, but he did not. He left it for Danny to discover. That meant his grandfather believed Danny could handle whatever came next. Danny just hoped the old man was right about that. Danny spent the next 3 days exploring every corner of the underground facility. He found storage rooms filled with equipment he could not identify, and chambers that seemed to serve no purpose he could understand. The ship remained sealed no matter what he tried. He was starting to think he would never figure out how anything worked when he accidentally touched a panel on the ship's exterior. In just the right way. The hull opened like a flower blooming and stairs extended down to the floor. The interior was even more impressive than the outside. The cockpit was designed for a single pilot with a chair that looked surprisingly comfortable. The controls were a mixture of physical switches and holographic displays that appeared when Danny sat down. He was afraid to touch anything important, so he just looked around trying to make sense of the layout. That was when he noticed a small crystal embedded in the console directly in front of him. It was pulsing with a faint green light. His grandfather's journal had mentioned something about a communication device but had not explained how to use it. Danny reached out and touched the crystal. The holographic display that materialized in front of him was so unexpected that Danny fell backward out of the chair. He scrambled to his feet and stared at the figure floating in the air above the console. It was humanoid in the basic sense of having 2 arms and 2 legs and a head. But that was where the similarities to humans ended. The being's skin was iridescent and shifted through colors like oil on water. Its eyes were large and dark and seemed to contain entire galaxies swirling in their depths. The figure looked at Danny with an expression that might have been surprise or concern or something else entirely. The being spoke, and somehow Danny could understand the words even though he knew they were not being spoken in English. The voice seemed to bypass his ears and form directly in his mind. The being introduced itself as Kelvin Thrace and explained that it was a Vorantine historian. Kelvin had worked with Danny's grandfather for over 30 years. The Vorantine seemed genuinely sad when Danny told him about his grandfather's death. Kelvin said that Danny's grandfather had been a good friend and a brave protector of the archive. Danny had about 1,000 questions, but Kelvin held up a hand that had too many fingers. The Vorantine said there were important things Danny needed to understand before anything else. He explained that the Vorantines were an ancient race that valued knowledge above all things. Millions of years ago, they had reached a level of technological advancement that most species could not even imagine, but they had learned a hard truth about the universe. Civilizations rose and fell constantly. Wars destroyed entire planets. Natural disasters wiped out species that had taken millions of years to evolve. Knowledge was being lost faster than it could be preserved. The Vorantines made a decision that would define their entire civilization. They would become archivists and engineers dedicated to preserving knowledge for future generations. They built repositories on thousands of worlds across the galaxy. Each repository contained technology and historical records and scientific discoveries from hundreds of different species. The facilities were hidden and protected by systems designed to last for millions of years. They were meant to be found only when a species reached a certain level of development. Earth had been chosen as one such site long before humans existed. Kelvin's colors shifted to something that looked like sadness as he explained what had gone wrong. There was another race called the Kryn Dominion. They were conquerors and warriors who believed that power came from controlling resources and technology. They had been hunting for Vorantine repositories for over 3 centuries. Whenever they found one, they would strip it of everything valuable and destroy what they could not use. They had already ransacked dozens of sites across the galaxy. Worse than that, they enslaved or destroyed any species they found near a repository. Danny's grandfather had made contact with the Vorentines in 1952, during the early days of human space exploration. It had been an accident similar to Danny's own discovery. The Vorentines had been monitoring Earth to see when humans would be ready for first contact. Danny's grandfather had proven himself to be trustworthy and intelligent. He agreed to help keep the facility hidden in exchange for access to some of the knowledge stored in the archive. He had used that knowledge carefully over the decades to help advance human technology in subtle ways that would not draw attention. Kelvin's next words made Danny's blood run cold. The Kryn had detected the facility's activation. When Danny entered the elevator and powered up the ship's systems, he had inadvertently sent a signal into space. It was not his fault because he had no way of knowing. But the result was the same. The Kryn had triangulated the signal, and now they knew exactly where this repository was located. They were on their way to Earth right now. Kelvin estimated they would arrive in less than a week. When they got here, they would do whatever it took to claim the facility and everything in it. Danny wanted to run away and pretend none of this was real. He wanted to seal the elevator and go back to his normal life fixing trucks and never thinking about aliens or galactic wars. But Kelvin showed him something that made running impossible. The Vorentine pulled up a holographic star map that showed hundreds of locations scattered across the galaxy. Each point of light represented another repository. This facility contained the master coordinates to every single one of them. If the Kryn obtained that information, they would be able to find and raid every remaining archive in the galaxy. Kelvin explained that some of those repositories contained weapons technology that could crack planets apart like eggs. Others held biological knowledge that could be turned into plagues capable of wiping out entire species. The Kryn would use all of it without hesitation or mercy. Every world in the galaxy would be at risk. Earth would be just the first domino to fall. Humanity's only chance was to defend this facility until help could arrive. The problem was that help was very far away and would take months to get here. Danny and whoever he could rally would be on their own against an enemy that had been conquering worlds for centuries. Danny sat in the pilot's chair and put his head in his hands. This was insane. He was a mechanic, not a soldier or a pilot or whatever else this situation needed. But Kelvin seemed to believe he could do this. The Vorentine explained that the ship Danny was sitting in was called a Sentinel-class vessel. It was designed specifically for rapid response and defensive operations. The ship could break atmosphere in seconds and engage targets in orbit. It was armed with weapons that could punch through the shields of most warships. More importantly, it had systems designed to interface with a human pilot through something called a neural link. Kelvin said he would teach Danny everything he needed to know. They had maybe 4 or 5 days before the Kryn arrived. It was not enough time to make Danny an expert, but it might be enough to give him a fighting chance. The Vorentine also explained that the facility had its own defenses. There were energy barriers that could withstand orbital bombardment. There were automated systems that could target and destroy incoming threats. But all of those systems needed someone to activate and control them. That someone would have to be Danny unless he could find others to help. Danny thought about his sister Katie, who worked with computers in Seattle. He thought about his best friend Ben, who had been a Marine before starting his security company. He thought about Lisa, who he had dated in college and who was now some kind of genius physicist. If he was going to do this impossible thing, he would need their help. He would need to convince them that aliens were real and that Earth was about to be attacked, and that a mechanic from Montana was somehow the key to humanity's survival. It sounded crazy even in his own head. But looking at Kelvin and the ship and the facility around him, Danny knew it was all true. His grandfather had protected this place for 50 years. Now it was Danny's turn. He just hoped he would not let the old man down. Danny stood outside the garage with his phone in his hand, trying to figure out how to explain any of this to his sister. Katie was smart and practical and would probably think he had lost his mind. But he needed her help. He took a deep breath and made the call. When she answered, he did not waste time with pleasantries. He told her he had found something in Grandfather's garage and needed her to come to Montana immediately. Katie said she was busy with work and could not just drop everything. That was when Danny decided to show rather than tell. He switched the call to video and carried his phone down the elevator. Katie's face on the screen went from annoyed to confused to absolutely shocked as the doors opened and revealed the facility. She stopped talking mid-sentence and just stared. Danny walked her through the main chamber, pointing the camera at the ship and the equipment, and the impossible architecture. Katie finally found her voice and said she would be on the next flight to Montana. She told Danny not to touch anything else until she got there. He agreed, even though he had already touched pretty much everything. Next, he called Ben Carter, who had been his best friend since they were kids. Ben had joined the Marines right out of high school and served 3 tours overseas before getting out and starting a private security company. He was exactly the kind of person Danny needed for what was coming. Ben answered on the second ring with his usual casual greeting. Danny told him he needed security help for something weird and possibly dangerous. Ben laughed and said weird and dangerous was his specialty. When Danny told him it involved aliens and an underground facility, Ben stopped laughing. Danny sent him the same video he had shown Katie. Ben was quiet for a long moment, then said he would bring some of his best people and be there in 12 hours. The hardest call was to Lisa Hayes. They had dated briefly in college before going their separate ways. She was a physicist now working at some research lab in California. Danny had not talked to her in almost 2 years. He was not sure she would even answer, but she did, and her voice was exactly as he remembered it. He explained that he needed her expertise with something he had found. Lisa was skeptical until he mentioned it involved technology that seemed to violate the laws of physics as humans understood them. That got her attention. Scientists loved mysteries. He sent her the video and heard her gasp on the other end. She said she would take emergency leave and drive up immediately. Katie arrived first because Seattle was closer than California or Ben's location in Colorado. She came through the garage door with 2 laptops and a bag full of equipment. When she stepped out of the elevator into the facility, she started crying. She walked around touching the walls and the equipment like she could not believe it was real. Danny showed her Kelvin's hologram, and she spent an hour just asking the Vorentine questions about how everything worked. Kelvin seemed pleased to have someone so interested in the technical details. Katie immediately began taking notes and making diagrams. Ben showed up 6 hours later with 3 of his team members. They were all former military and had the kind of calm, professional demeanor that made Danny feel slightly better about their chances. Ben walked through the facility with his tactical mind already working. He pointed out sight lines and choke points and places where defenses could be set up. His team started taking measurements and making plans. When Danny introduced them to Kelvin, one of Ben's guys actually saluted the hologram. Kelvin seemed amused by that. Lisa arrived last, driving through the night to get there. She looked exhausted, but her eyes lit up the moment she saw the facility. She went straight to the ship and started examining the hull with instruments she had brought. She kept muttering to herself about energy readings and quantum signatures. When Kelvin explained how the elevator worked by folding dimensions, Lisa actually laughed with delight. She said it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. Danny was just glad someone understood the science because he certainly did not. Over the next 2 days, the team worked around the clock to prepare. Kelvin became their teacher, showing them everything they needed to know. He taught Katie how the facility's computer systems worked. They were based on quantum processing that made human computers look like stone tools by comparison. Katie managed to create a bridge between the Vorentine systems and her laptops. This gave them displays and interfaces they could actually read and understand. She set up monitoring systems and created tactical displays that showed the airspace above Montana. Kelvin taught Ben and his team how to activate the facility's defense grid. There were energy barriers that could be projected from hidden emitters around the property. The barriers were strong enough to withstand orbital bombardment, at least for a while. Ben's team also found storage rooms containing Vorentine weapons. They were sleek handheld devices that fired concentrated energy bolts. Ben tested one on the facility's firing range and watched it punch a hole through 6 feet of solid rock. He smiled grimly and said these would do just fine. Lisa worked with Kelvin to understand the facility's power source. It was a device the size of a car that drew energy directly from Earth's magnetic field. The science behind it made no sense according to human physics, but it worked perfectly. Lisa discovered that the power core could be reconfigured to extend the defensive barriers. With some modifications, they could protect not just the facility, but several square miles around it. She and Katie spent 12 hours straight working on the necessary changes. When they finally got it working, Lisa collapsed from exhaustion, but she was smiling. Danny spent most of his time in the Sentinel ship learning how to fly it. Kelvin guided him through the process of establishing a neural link with the ship's systems. It involved sitting in the pilot's chair while the ship scanned his brain and nervous system. The sensation was deeply uncomfortable, like someone was reading his thoughts. But when it was done, Danny could feel the ship respond to his intentions almost before he consciously formed them. Kelvin said it would take weeks to master the link completely, but Danny was learning faster than expected. Perhaps it ran in the family. The Vorantine taught Danny about the ship's weapons and defensive systems. The Sentinel had energy cannons that could target multiple threats simultaneously. It had missiles that could track targets across vast distances. Most impressively, it had something called a cascade driver. Kelvin explained that this weapon channeled the ship's entire power core into a single devastating blast. It could crack a warship's shields and disable its systems, but using it would drain the Sentinel completely. Danny would be dead in space until the power core recharged, which could take an hour. It was a last resort weapon. On the fourth day, Kelvin's hologram appeared in the main chamber with news that made everyone stop what they were doing. The Vorantine's colors had shifted to something dark and ominous. He said the sensors had detected 3 Kryn warships entering the solar system. They would reach Earth in less than 18 hours. The enemy was coming faster than expected. They had accelerated their approach, which meant they considered this facility a high-priority target. Kelvin looked at Danny and the others and said they had done everything they could to prepare. Now they would have to trust in their abilities and in each other. Ben gathered his team and went over the defensive plan one more time. Katie triple-checked all her systems and made sure the monitoring equipment was working perfectly. Lisa ran final diagnostics on the power core and the extended barriers. Danny sat in the pilot's chair of the Sentinel and tried to calm his racing heart. He looked at the faces of his sister and his friends and felt a surge of determination. They were a mechanic, a software engineer, a physicist, and a handful of Marines. They were about to face an alien armada. The odds were not good. But they were not going to back down. This was their world, and they would defend it with everything they had. Danny's grandfather had protected this facility for 50 years. Now it was their turn to stand in the gap. The Kryn were coming, and humanity was ready to show them what a fight looked like. The Kryn warships arrived just after dawn. Danny was already in the Sentinel's pilot chair when Katie's voice came through the communication system. She said the sensors had detected 3 massive vessels taking up position in high orbit above North America. The ships were each over a mile long and bristling with weapons. They did not announce themselves or make any demands. They simply began scanning the surface with beams of energy that Katie said were incredibly precise. They were hunting for the facility's exact location. Danny knew they would find it soon. Ben's voice joined the communication channel. He said his team was in position around the property perimeter. The defensive barriers were active but not visible until something struck them. He had set up automated gun positions using conventional weapons combined with Vorantine energy cells that Katie had adapted. Lisa reported that the power core was running at optimal levels, and the extended shields were ready. Everyone was as prepared as they could be. Now they just had to wait for the Kryn to make their move. They did not have to wait long. The lead warship fired a scanning pulse directly at the garage location. The pulse hit Katie's detection systems and lit them up like Christmas lights. Danny watched his displays as the Kryn ships adjusted their positions. They knew exactly where the facility was now. Kelvin's hologram appeared next to Danny and said the Kryn would likely start with a ground assault to try and capture the facility intact. If that failed, they would resort to orbital bombardment. Either way, the fight was about to start. Danny launched the Sentinel through a concealed exit that opened in the hillside behind the garage. The ship responded to his thoughts as smoothly as moving his own arm. They broke through the surface and accelerated toward the sky. The sensation of going from underground to space in less than 20 seconds was absolutely terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Danny's displays showed the 3 Kryn warships growing larger as he approached. His ship was tiny compared to them, like a sparrow flying toward 3 dragons. The Kryn opened fire first. Energy weapons that could vaporize a city block converged on the Sentinel's position. But the ship moved like it was reading Danny's mind, because it was. He thought about dodging, and the Sentinel twisted through space, avoiding the incoming fire by margins that made his stomach drop. Danny returned fire, targeting the scanner arrays on the nearest warship. His energy cannon struck true, and one of the massive vessel's sensor clusters exploded in a shower of sparks. The Kryn had not expected him to be this fast or this accurate. Back at the facility, Katie was tracking everything on her displays. She said 3 smaller ships had just detached from the warships and were heading down through the atmosphere. They were dropships carrying ground troops. Ben acknowledged and said his team was ready. Danny wanted to stay in orbit and keep the warships occupied, but those dropships were heading straight for his sister and friends. He made a split-second decision and dove after the descending craft. The Sentinel could operate in any environment, and Danny pushed the ship through maneuvers that would have torn apart any human aircraft. He caught up to the first dropship over the Rocky Mountains and fired a sustained burst from his energy cannons. The dropship's shields held for maybe 3 seconds before collapsing. Danny's next shots tore through the hull and detonated the ship's power core. The explosion lit up the early morning sky like a second sun. Wreckage rained down across unpopulated mountain ranges. The second dropship tried to evade, but Danny was getting better at using the neural link. He anticipated the enemy pilot's moves and fired before the ship completed its turn. The dropship exploded and fell burning toward the forest below. The third dropship made it to the ground and landed hard about 200 yards from the garage. Its rear ramp dropped and 30 Kryn soldiers in powered armor came pouring out. Danny pulled up and circled overhead, but he could not fire without risking hitting the facility. Ben's voice came through steady and calm. He said they had visual on the enemy and were engaging. The sound of gunfire erupted across the communication channel. Danny watched his overhead display as green dots representing Ben's team moved to intercept the red dots of Kryn soldiers. The powered armor made the aliens tough targets, but Ben's team was using cover and tactics that the Kryn were not expecting. Varantine energy weapons fired by human marines proved to be devastatingly effective. The first wave of Kryn soldiers went down hard. In orbit, the 3 warships were charging their main weapons. Danny's sensors screamed warnings as massive amounts of energy built up in the ship's primary cannons. Kelvin's voice cut through the chaos. He said those weapons were preparing to glass the entire region. If they fired, nothing would survive within 100 miles. Danny had maybe 90 seconds before they reached critical charge. He looked at his displays and made a decision that would either save everyone or doom them all. He pointed the Sentinel toward the lead warship and accelerated to maximum speed. The neural link fed him information faster than conscious thought. Target distance, shield strength, weapon charge levels. Danny armed the Cascade driver, knowing it was his only chance to stop what was coming. Kelvin had warned him this weapon would drain the ship completely, but there was no other choice. The Kryn had to be stopped now. On the ground, Ben's team was winning their fight, but more Kryn soldiers were taking up positions around the dropship. They had heavy weapons now and were firing at the facility's main entrance. The defensive barriers flared into visibility each time a shot struck them. The shields were holding, but Lisa reported they were drawing significant power. If the orbital bombardment started while the shields were under ground assault, they might not hold. Everything depended on Danny stopping those warships. The lead Kryn vessel fired its point defense weapons at the approaching Sentinel. Hundreds of smaller energy bolts filled space between the 2 ships. Danny's hands moved across the controls while his mind directed the ship's evasive systems. The Sentinel twisted and rolled through the incoming fire. Some shots struck the shields, and Danny felt each impact like a physical blow through the neural link, but most missed because he was moving too fast and too unpredictably. Danny got within firing range and activated the Cascade driver. The Sentinel transformed as every system channeled power into the weapon. The ship became a lance of pure energy that punched through space with impossible speed. The beam struck the lead warship's shields, and for a moment nothing seemed to happen. Then the shields collapsed in a cascading failure that rippled across the massive vessel's hull. Danny's beam tore through armor and deck plating and critical systems. The warship's main weapon exploded before it could fire, killing the energy buildup in a massive internal detonation. The lead ship went dark. Its lights failed and its engines cut out. The massive vessel began tumbling slowly in orbit as secondary explosions bloomed across its surface. Danny's ship drifted powerless as the Cascade driver's recharge cycle began. He was completely vulnerable, but he had taken out the flagship. The other 2 Kryn warships immediately broke off their attack runs. Without their command ship, they were not willing to continue the engagement. Danny watched them turn and accelerate toward the edge of the solar system. They were retreating. Katie's voice came through, filled with relief. She said the remaining Kryn soldiers on the ground had stopped fighting. Without their ships overhead, they were surrendering. Ben confirmed that his team had the situation under control. They had lost no one, though 2 of his Marines were injured. The Kryn ground force had been neutralized. Lisa reported that the power core and shields were stable. The facility was secure. They had won. Danny sat in the pilot's chair as his ship slowly drifted in orbit, waiting for the power core to recharge. He could see Earth below, looking peaceful and beautiful, and completely unaware of how close it had come to destruction. He could see the disabled Kryn warship tumbling away toward deep space. He had done it. They had all done it. A mechanic and his sister and his friends had just defended Earth against an alien invasion. It should have been impossible, but here they were. Kelvin's hologram appeared in the cockpit, and the Vorontine's colors were bright and pleased. He said Danny and his team had accomplished something remarkable. Very few species successfully defended themselves during their first contact with the Kryn. Humanity had just announced itself to the galaxy as a force to be reckoned with. But Kelvin's colors shifted to something more serious as he delivered his warning. This had been just a scouting force. The Kryn would return with more ships and better preparation. This was not the end of the threat. It was only the beginning. Earth had won the first battle, but the war was just starting. The battle had been visible from Earth. 3 massive warships in orbit and aerial combat that lit up the morning sky could not be explained away as weather phenomena or military exercises. Within hours, every government on the planet was demanding answers. News helicopters tried to fly over the Montana property, but the defensive barriers were still active and forced them to turn back. Satellite images showed the crashed Kryn dropship and the evidence of combat around the garage. The world knew something had happened, and they wanted explanations. Ben's military contacts helped manage the initial response. He called in favors with people who had the authority to create a perimeter around the property and keep civilians away. But everyone knew this could not stay secret for long. Danny sat in the facility's main chamber with Katie and Lisa and Ben, and made a decision that would change everything. They could not hide this. Humanity deserved to know the truth about what was out there and what had just happened. They needed to tell the world about the Vorontines and the Kryn and the war that was coming. Danny reached out to the United Nations through channels Ben provided. He invited representatives from the UN and the United States government and several allied nations to come to Montana. He said he had information about the events that morning, and it needed to be shared in person. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, a delegation of officials and military leaders and scientists arrived at the property. Danny met them at the garage entrance with Kelvin's holographic form beside him. He led them down the elevator and watched their faces as the facility was revealed. Some looked terrified. Others looked excited. A few looked like they might faint. Danny stood in front of the Sentinel ship and told them everything. He explained about his grandfather and the Vorontines and the archive. He told them about the Kryn and their hunt for ancient technology. He showed them recordings Katie had made of the battle. He laid out the truth that humanity was not alone in the universe and never had been. They were now players in a conflict that spanned the galaxy. The reactions ranged from disbelief to panic to anger that this had been kept secret. Admiral Janet Pierce from the United States Space Force stepped forward and asked the most important question. She wanted to know what humanity needed to do to survive what was coming. Danny appreciated her focus on practical matters. He turned to Kelvin and asked the Vorentine to explain. Kelvin's hologram expanded to show a map of Earth with 6 locations marked in addition to Montana. He said there were other Vorentine facilities hidden across the planet. Each contained ships and technology and knowledge that humanity would need. Over the next 3 months, Danny's life became something he never could have imagined. He worked with Katie and government technicians to locate and activate the other 6 facilities. One was hidden under the Antarctic ice. Another was buried in the Australian outback. A third was concealed beneath the Pacific Ocean. Each site contained different resources. Some had more ships. Others had manufacturing equipment that could produce Vorentine technology. One facility was entirely dedicated to medical and biological knowledge. Together, they represented a treasure trove that would accelerate human development by centuries. Lisa led an international team of scientists in studying how Vorentine technology worked. She found ways to integrate it with human engineering, creating hybrid systems that were more reliable than pure Vorentine tech. Her breakthroughs in power generation revolutionized Earth's energy infrastructure. Within 6 months, every major city had access to clean, unlimited power drawn from the planet's magnetic field. The environmental benefits alone were staggering. But more importantly, it freed up resources for the military buildup that everyone knew was necessary. Katie pioneered the development of quantum communication systems based on Vorentine principles. She created a network that allowed instant communication between Earth and the defensive platforms being constructed in orbit. The first platform went online 4 months after the battle. It was a hybrid of human weapons and Vorentine shield technology. More platforms followed as the shipyards and the orbital facilities began full production. Earth was building a defensive network that would make any future Kryn attack much more costly. Ben became the commandant of Earth's first space defense force. He recruited and trained pilots from military forces around the world. The training program used simulators based on the Sentinel's neural link technology. Pilots learned to fly Vorentine ships using the same methods Danny had learned. The learning curve was steep, but humans proved to be surprisingly good at it. Ben's force won 3 more engagements against Kryn scouting parties over the next year. Each victory reinforced humanity's reputation across the galaxy as a species that would not back down. Danny found himself serving as humanity's ambassador to the Vorentine archives. Kelvin introduced him to other historians and engineers from across the Vorentine network. Most were surprised that humans had not only survived a Kryn assault but had driven them off. That kind of determination was rare among younger species. Danny attended virtual councils with beings from a dozen different races. He learned about the wider conflict and the politics of galactic civilization. It was overwhelming, but he adapted because he had to. The world changed rapidly as Vorentine knowledge spread through human society. Medical advances eliminated most diseases and extended human lifespan. Agricultural technology ended hunger in most regions. Transportation systems based on the same dimensional folding used by the elevator revolutionized travel. But not all the changes were positive. There were conflicts over who controlled access to the new technology. Some nations tried to hoard resources. Criminal organizations sought to steal and sell Vorentine equipment. Humanity was growing, but also struggling with the responsibilities that came with advanced technology. 2 years after Danny found the elevator in his grandfather's garage, he stood on the bridge of humanity's first deep space exploration vessel. The ship was named Frontier, and it represented the best of human and Vorentine engineering. The vessel was massive compared to the Sentinel, with room for a crew of 200. It had weapon systems that could defend against multiple warships. More importantly, it had faster-than-light engines that would allow humans to explore beyond their solar system for the first time. Katie served as the Frontier's chief technology officer. She had spent 2 years mastering Vorentine systems and developing new innovations. Lisa was the lead scientist overseeing a research division that would study everything they encountered in deep space. Ben commanded the security detachment, which included 50 of his best Marines equipped with the latest hybrid weapons. The team that had defended a garage in Montana was now leading humanity to the stars. Their mission was to reach a major Vorentine archive that Kelvin believed held crucial information. The archive was located in a star system 300 light-years from Earth. It contained records about the Kryn and their weaknesses and potentially allies who might help humanity in the coming conflict. The journey would take 3 months even with faster-than-light travel. Danny would spend that time learning everything he could about galactic politics and warfare. As the Frontier prepared to jump to lightspeed, Danny stood at the observation window watching Earth slowly rotate below. He thought about his grandfather and all the years the old man had spent protecting humanity's secret. His grandfather had known this day would come when humans would have to step out into a dangerous galaxy. He had prepared the way by keeping the facility safe and leaving clues for someone to find. Danny wished the old man could see what his protection had led to. The elevator in the garage had been more than just a doorway to an underground facility. It had been a doorway to humanity's future. What had started as one mechanic's curious discovery had awakened an entire species to the reality of the universe. Earth was no longer isolated and ignorant. Humans now knew they were part of something much larger and more dangerous and more wonderful than they had ever imagined. They had been forced into a war they did not choose, but they were facing it with courage and determination. The Frontier's engines powered up, and space around the ship began to fold in ways that defied normal physics. In moments, they would leave the solar system and venture into the unknown. Danny felt nervous and excited and ready. The galaxy was about to learn what humanity was capable of. They were survivors and innovators and warriors when they needed to be. The Kryn had started this conflict by attacking Earth, but humans would be the ones to finish it on their own terms. Danny took his seat in the captain's chair as Katie counted down to the jump. Lisa was monitoring the engines. Ben was checking security systems. Everyone was doing their part. The jump commenced and the stars stretched into lines of light as the frontier leaped forward. They were on their way to the first of many adventures among the stars. Earth was behind them, but not forgotten. Everything they did out here would be to protect their home world and prove that humanity belonged in this galaxy. The war was far from over, but Danny knew they would face it together. That was what humans did best when pushed to the edge.